an adjunct in the Department of Transnational Asian Studies. Been here a few years and am now retired, but I'm very happy to be brought back into the fold, and particularly because of the guest that we have here today. I have done few good things in my life, but one of them was to invite a lot of good speakers to Rice. In the China field, John Fairbank, Joseph Needham. I invited the great beat poet Allen Ginsberg. Well, we have in our company now another great speaker, Andrew Schonebaum, a professor at the University of Maryland. So I should probably say a little bit about how we got to know each other. We work in somewhat similar fields, and as it turns out, we became academic pen pals about 4 years ago. And we've exchanged emails since then, but we never met each other until last night. And it has been a great pleasure to know this gentleman and to be able to talk about shared interests. He's a remarkable scholar. His first book, which is called, don't tell me, Novel Medicine, has to do with the intersection of healing and literature. And it is a really wonderful book. It was published, I think, in 2016 and was very well reviewed. And I read it as, I have read almost everything that Professor Schonebaum has written, as a matter of fact. And that includes not only this wonderful monograph of 2016, but also a couple of books on the reading of two of the great novels in Chinese history, Chinese culture, The Dream of the Red Chamber, and also the Jinping Mei. How do we translate it? Yeah. Okay, yeah. And these two books are really masterpieces that Professor Schonebaum has organized into books of interpretation. And it takes a lot of effort not only to coordinate this kind of thing, but also to have the vision to do it. It's a very bold, creative, and interesting act. And he's written an online interactive text on reading classical Chinese, which is also an extraordinary achievement. And putting aside dozens and dozens of conference papers, he has also written all kinds of articles on every conceivable topic: divination, the Chinese practice of cutting flesh to heal illnesses for one's parents, the idea of Shakespeare in China. I haven't read that one.
But it was like an early effort. You
really interested in that sort of thing. And so he and I have very close interests in what you might call, again, I guess, the curiosity and fantasy and common knowledge. This is a book that is almost completed. I am working on a similar book that I've just started. And I've decided that because Professor Schonebaum is going to complete this very soon, and I have no idea when I'll complete it, I realize that my footnotes are going to all say, see Professor Schonebaum for this particular, for illumination on this particular point. I say this in a spirit of cooperation. He's been very generous in sharing materials, including the manuscript for this book with me. So there are lots of things to say about him, but you want to hear him. And so the last thing I want to say is that I noticed the other day when I Googled his Chinese name, I came up with a couple of talks that he'd given at two of the most prestigious Chinese-speaking institutions in the world. And one of them is the Yuelu Academy that is now part of Hunan University. It's existed for 1,000 years as an educational institution throughout that entire time. And then Academia Sinica in Taiwan. And so I think he's going to speak in English today, but he could speak in Chinese. And without further ado, Professor Andrew Schonebaum.
Thanks so much for that lovely and somewhat facetious introduction, Professor Smith. And thanks, J-Law, for having me here too. I'm so happy to be here at Rice. This is my first time in Texas. 50 years old. Never been to Texas. So far it's been lovely. Really appreciate it. And I'm excited to have a chance to talk to you guys today. So it's a little bit self-aggrandizing. I'm going to be sort of telling you about this book that I have now finished. It's
Very
in
close.
press.
Am
It's
I
in
right?
press. It's done. So yeah, I'm going to sort of bore you, hopefully not too badly, with sort of an introduction to the things that I'm thinking about in this book. And I don't know, as I've gotten further along in my career, I feel like I really just do one thing, but then I try to hide the fact that I just do one thing under some sort of pretty dressing and frosting and cherries. But that one thing is essentially that I think that people read at different levels. I think we sort of ignore that fact. And I think a lot of people who are sort of marginally literate or newly literate read in different ways. And they wanted different things from their texts, no matter which bibliographic genre they were categorized in. So that's really my thing. That's the thing I do. But then I try to show how that works in a number of different ways. But so anyway, the other thing I want to talk about today in particular is curiosity. Sort of both the impulse, in both senses of the term curiosity, right? The impulse to learn and to investigate and to classify things, but also curiosity as a noun, like curiosities, right? Things that are strange or anomalous. And obviously these meanings are related, and because the objects of investigation are frequently anomalies. So in Classifying the Unseen, this book that I have finished, I seek to know how these marginally literate people in early modern China understood their world, especially the unseen world, right? Like how do you, by unseen I mean not just invisible, but overlooked or tiny or distant or conceptual, and in a time of increasing weight that given to empirical evidence, how did you investigate the forces undergirding technology, or the weather, or properties of drugs, or the behavior of animals, or the movement of the stars, or the structure of time or of fate, especially when there's no visual context. So I try to do this, I try to get at how readers understood their world by examining practical literature, things like medical texts and encyclopedias and almanacs and guidebooks that were really increasingly popular in like the late 16th and throughout the 17th century. These kinds of texts were designed to educate and to inform. Things like local and court histories and gazetteers and eventually newspapers, recorded natural disasters and omens and unexplained phenomena. But I also think it's important to look not just at practical literature, or sometimes what I call epistemic literature, but also entertainment literature, right? The novels, anecdotes, and notes that were published primarily to amuse and beguile, right? But which also conveyed information. Existing histories of Chinese science, they frequently focus on the response of like scientists at court to Jesuit or Western medicine. And so my hope is that I'd like to expand on those histories by examining debates on the margins of that elite discourse. And these are often found in places like commentaries or appendices or sequels and supplements. So I try to draw on these connections between epistemic and entertainment texts, and I hope that by doing so I can kind of advance a little more robust understanding of how an increasingly literate population in early modern China perceived and experienced the natural world. And parts of the natural world obviously were strange and scary. And so I examine this curious in context and inevitably sort of reveal fears of people and practices like magical poisons and secret medical practices and that supposedly happened along the borders of an expanding empire, and foreign curiosities that penetrated the urban centers. I also try to understand how things were investigated and envisioned, without this visual context, either because they were everywhere, like water and wind and life itself, or because they were nowhere, like the future, because they were rarely seen, like dragons or rainbows, or seen only through their effects, like thunder. So my book is really about sort of reading, visualizing, and envisioning. So let's see here, where am I? So let's begin our conversation by asking what is strange, right? What characterizes strangeness? Against what is strange conceived? Is it against common knowledge? Is it against textual authority? So let's consider these two passages. These are dragons. I'm not sure if you can see them, but let's consider two passages about dragons. Nice. Two dragons.
Just the front
This would be
line.
great.
Just the front lines.
Yeah, I think it's up.
That's the projector.
Oh.
All right. Well, we'll
Go to the button.
The podium may have a control.
I'm too afraid to touch it.
Yeah.
It's very complicated. Okay. Well, if there were enough students in the room, I would ask for people to be brave and read this. But are there any students who'd be brave and read this in English? All right, I'll read it. All right. There was a man who washed his hands with water flowing down from the eaves of his house, and suddenly he felt that something had penetrated his fingernail. At first it looked like a hair, and then after a few days it looked like a thread. And he was unable to stretch or flex his finger, and this was when he first realized that the cause was a hidden dragon. He consulted Dr. Shi Changyong, who told him that the recipe books had no record of such a problem, but if he were to grind dung beetle and apply it to the finger, he could avoid being struck by thunder. So he did as he was told, and then thunder and fire entwined his body, so he hastily took a needle and pricked his finger. Something leapt out of the finger, and he avoided calamity. Okay? And then we've got this other passage over here. There was a peasant woman who went into the fields when a strong wind was blowing, whipping dust and sand into her face. She felt as if a wheat chaff was stuck in one eye, causing irritation. And despite rubbing and blowing into it, the discomfort did not subside. Upon a closer examination, although the eyeball itself was unharmed, there was a red line winding through the flesh of the eye. Oh, trigger warning, by the way, if you've got eyeball issues. Some said, this is a hibernating dragon. The woman, fearful and resigned to her fate, waited for death. After more than 3 months, a sudden torrential rain came, and with a loud clap of thunder, the line split and disappeared from her eye, leaving her unharmed. Okay? So, two similar sounding passages about dragons that infiltrate and hibernate, perhaps, in the human body. And the one on the left is from late 16th century medical text, Materia Medica, sometimes it's called, the Ben Cao Gang. Extremely famous, like imperially sanctioned, definitely nonfiction for the use of doctors and healers. And it's really, I talk about it as like sort of compendium of natural knowledge, but if any text, can be called like clearly nonfiction, it's this one, right? It's meant for use to save lives. And then the other text is from the Liao Chai Zhi, which is usually classed as supernatural stories or like ghost stories or anomalous accounts. Of 150 years later. So I just want to sort of throw this out, that you know, a reader, and sort of a non-savvy reader, could be excused, could be forgiven for you know, thinking that these are true, that these are real, that this is real information, actionable information, actually. Now, presumably, the difference between the fact and the strange story is dung beetles, right? Of course. Presumably, the doctor wanted to use dung beetles to effect a cure in this passage because they share with dragons an association with thunder, which was believed at the time to be the force that kills people in storms rather than lightning, because it's loud and scary. And the beetle was used topically rather than internally, presumably to avoid injuring the patient when thunder struck. And this account, fantastical though it may seem to the modern reader, obviously seemed probable to Li Shizhen, who included it in this monumental authoritative work of natural history. Li himself had found it in another account, which had found it in another account. So genres had already become sort of obscure, if Li was at all interested in what genre this text was drawn from. But readers encountering this story in any of those texts likely found it as probable as Li did, given the widely held belief that, number one, dragons cause and respond to rain. Number two, dragons can transform into myriad creatures and sizes. Number three, dragons often cause catastrophic wind and flood damage. And four, dragons can act like parasites, hibernating in the human body until called upon by heaven or thunder to come out and do its bidding. That they might accidentally invade the body and be drawn out by thunder, something believed to roust bugs and snakes from hibernation in the spring, was a sensible extension of known properties, namely that dragons are like bugs. This sort of invasion and extraction was commonplace. Xie Zhaozhe, the author of 1616 Miscellany, writes that thunder-striking people can come either from dragons or from rising out of the ground. And those struck are either being punished by heaven or simply, unfortunately, in its path. Misbehaving dragons fear thunder and, quote, often flee into people's homes, hiding in walls or human ears, noses, or in cows' horns. Okay, so that's the first example, right? Like what kind of texts are these? What are we learning from them? What is considered strange, right? And so to some extent, actually, I think the weird thing about this text is that the woman who has a dragon in her eyeball does not die. And she doesn't die, and it's without the use of dung beetle, right? Like, that's the really strange thing here. Anyway, so this is just sort of one example of the sorts of things I'm trying to talk about in this book, and so I want to just sort of briefly consider a few images with you that I think are sort of representative of the themes that sort of undergird my discussions of common knowledge and curiosity and belief and how do you vet information in the pre-modern world, right? So I'm going to show you some images that all come from a set of prints that were published together, and it's just known as Prints of the Story of the Western Wing. And the Story of the Western Wing is a 13th century sort of romantic comedy play, musical play. That was absolutely the most famous play of its day. It was as famous as they get, right? And I imagine anyone living in a big city in the late Ming would have heard of it, if not have seen it. And it's a love story between this guy, Zhang Sheng, and Sui Yingying. And it was absolutely common knowledge. If people hadn't read the play or seen it, they certainly had heard of this story. So it was common knowledge. But the story was also real in its potentially lethal effects. It was known as a lover's Bible, and potentially fatal if readers were, because readers were in real danger of pining away under its influence, as numerous accounts claim. The play was based on a story from a few centuries earlier that claims to be autobiographical, which might have contributed to the play's popularity. The story of the Western Wing begins with Zhang Sheng, a young scholar on his way to take the imperial examination. And while on his way, he takes refuge at the Monastery of Universal Salvation, where he falls in love with the beautiful Cui Yingying, who is lodging there too, with her mother and maidservant. The exceptional beauty of Yingying has attracted the attention of a bandit who, with his gang, besieges the monastery and demands that the young woman be delivered to him. If not, he threatens to slaughter all of the residents of the monastery and the young man Zhang Sheng. He saves them all by writing a letter and sending a monk through the ranks of the bandit army to his friend, the White Horse General, who responds at once with his army, quickly crushing the bandits. And Zhang Sheng is entirely credited with this achievement, the story making it clear that he saved everyone through the sole force of his writing brush. Anyway, after these events, the love story unfolds, right? And Yingying's mother publicly pledges that she'll marry him in return for saving the monastery and its denizens, but she later takes back her word since Zhang Sheng is just a poor student with no connections anyway. So this plunges the lovers into despair, and after a long and secret courtship with the help of the maidservant Hong Liang, Zhang and Yingying communicate, exchange poems, and eventually consummate their love. And Yingying's mother eventually discovers this liaison, and to hide the disgrace, reluctantly agrees to their marriage. But she imposes a final condition on Zhang that he must first succeed in the examinations. So the prints in this book, they depict different scenes from the play, and they point both to the fantastical dreaminess of the play, but also its ubiquity and mundanity. And most of the prints in this collection portray scenes from the play on objets d'art, pots and screens and mirrors. These objects depicted in the prints are exquisite, but they're common in real life. And scenes on them are well known, fantastical, and possibly true, right? Many of the objects in the prints allude to double meanings, like a lantern that projects shadows. Like these are the bandits, like chasing each other around on the outside, and lit from within, the lantern would cast these shadows on the walls. So a lot of these objects, point to sort of double meanings and allude to this sort of truth and falsity encoded both in the play and in these images. So they're painted on a lantern that projects shadows, double screens, dressing mirrors, and so on. These were real objects, in real life. And those real objects commonly did depict scenes from this or other plays. So the prints are sort of realistic in that regard. This print depicts a scene acted out by puppeteers with unused props, over here. I just like playing with the laser. And the print highlights the story's layered textual and performance histories, and it's also its constructiveness, right? But the picture's also extremely real, capturing a practice of daily life that would have been a familiar street scene in all its detail. But there's one print that stands out from the rest in my mind, and it depicts a dream that Zhang Sheng has while traveling to the capital to take his exams. In the dream, Yingying appears at the inn where Zhang is staying, and explains in song that she could not bear being separated from Zhang. And she's thus run away from the monastery in the middle of the night and traveled alone with bound feet all of this way, she made her way to him so that they could journey on together. And John marvels at her intrepidity and sings about his tender feelings and his determination never to be separated from her again. And suddenly, the gang of bandits, the gang of bandits appear, from earlier and demand that the girl be handed over to them. Zhang is disconcerted, but Ying, in a tone of commanding authority, tells him to leave this to her. She opens the door of the inn and confronts the bandits herself, scolding them with perfect self-control and authority. And she goes on insulting the rascals. But the bandits snatch her and take her away and leave the stage. And at the same time, Zhang Sheng wakes up, screaming, so it was a dream. And from that point on until the end of the act, he's sort of bewildered, and his perception of what exactly was a dream is never clear. And the verses he sings are really ambiguous. When dawn breaks, he continues his journey to the capital with his young servant amid a sense of irredeemable loss. But the print, the reason I really love this print, is it presents this dream not as a dream, but as a mirage. And the mirages, which were called shenlo, this is a shen. Shen is a giant clam demon that was cataloged in the Benzhao Gongmu as a sub-dragon. It's a minor dragon. So these are really believed to exist, okay? They're in all the natural histories, like everybody knows that giant clam dragons exist in the ocean, and that their qi produces what we now call mirages, right? But in Chinese are called shen buildings, right? Because they frequently appeared as cities on the sea. So the illustrator here portrays dream as mirage, right? And the question is, is a mirage real, right? It's a real phenomenon, like people can see it, you can share it with people, but are the cities in a mirage real? Are they glimpses of an alternate reality? Are they really there? And obviously this artist is suggesting that they're like dreams. In this case, images of a play that were full of motifs on porcelain or subjects of scrutiny in public theater were tantamount to these cities, these mirages, right? These fantasies that might be real or might be imaginary. And the artist adopts this same sort of dream motif, this sort of swirly cloud-looking thing, is borrowed from the usual motif for what a dream looks like. And so this is a different illustrated edition of the same play, where Zhang Sheng is asleep here, and he's dreaming this same dream with the bandits and Ying. Let's see here, move forward. Go to the next slide. Anyway, these curly swirling lines that begin in Zhang's head and grow to rend the image in two, dividing it between the real dreamer and the illusory dream. Dreams were understood by many to be visions of a future reality, and mirages were understood to be a current or alternate one. But if Zhang Sheng is dreaming, he may be divining the future, right? If his vision is a mirage, we realize his alternative vision of Ying. And so what was being represented either as mirage or dream was Zhang Sheng's rehashing of what had really happened in the play already, but edited and revised in his mind. In the previous image, we have Zhang Sheng's dream, a scene from a play reproduced by something real, a shen, a giant clam. And in this image, these are roughly contemporaneous, we witness the dreamer and his edited vision of reality in a dream. So if the artist replaces the dreamer with natural phenomena, is it a dream or is it a fact? Which depiction is more real, right? Which one makes more sense? Is the shen in the context of a book that plays on motifs of truth and fiction less real than it is in a text that depicts dragons, with which shen was usually classed? Okay. So just wanted to get you thinking about this sort of play between truth and fiction and the problems for newly literate or marginally literate people who are trying to investigate their worlds. So classifying this, the title of my book is called Classifying the Unseen. And so I'm thinking about classifying as a way of knowing, right? Like we like to create groups and define them by including and excluding things, texts or data points. We inventory things and we invent kinds of things. In the early modern period, nothing was collected and classified as much as information itself in the form of texts. There was a rage for epistemic texts. How do you pass the exams? How do you predict the future? How do you build a house? How do you behave in a brothel? How do you sow crops? How do you paint? How do you write poetry? How do you read the stars? How do you raise children? And so on. And some of these texts were explicitly epistemic. The encyclopedia, the textbook, the compendia, but others sought to gather and disseminate information that had no use aside from describing the world, thereby helping readers to locate themselves in it. So when it comes to natural science, the taxonomic imagination tended to break objects down into their component parts, right, and then group things together that shared the most important of those parts. The components were sometimes names, words or parts of words. Origins were essential, especially for categorizing medicinal herbs or distinguishing between genuine items and imitations. The taxonomy of collectiana and other texts, interested in the phenomenal world, often reinforced these sort of tripartite branches of heaven, earth, and man, which was and then those were subdivided into category and subdivided further into items, and which was a scheme broad enough to encompass all manner of thing in practice. But other epistemic texts had more specific categories of knowledge, and most were variations on a theme. For popular how-to texts, such as daily use encyclopedia or almanacs, the categories of information reflected the desire of literate commoners, especially merchants, for upward mobility and encouraged self-reliance. Some had the words children in their titles, like don't rely on others, like don't seek others for this information, right? And so these practical epistemic texts that became common in the Ming and Qing period suggest profound socioeconomic changes, particularly when it comes to the increasingly large population of successful merchants seeking information about how to understand and perhaps how to manipulate their health, their fortunes, their worlds, and their futures. And Professor Smith talks about this too. He talks about how a number of these epistemic texts were explicitly written for merchants. Some of them had titles like Categories of Essential Concern for Literati and Merchants. So these encyclopedias, and this is something Professor Smith has worked on quite a bit, and I totally rip off all of this stuff from his book, The Qing Dynasty and Traditional Chinese Culture, which is a lovely book and completely readable and accessible. But you can see, like, this is essentially the title page of a common. It's called a daily use encyclopedia. It's usually classed as an Yong Lei Shu. And this is like the table of contents. This is just, and this is the translation of some of this stuff up here. Just different categories of information, right? Things that you may want to know. But I think that what's sort of important to notice is that that a lot of these are actually not useful categories, right? They don't, like, yes, mourning the sacrifice, yes. Time selection, yes. How to do divination, yes. But like, what about barbarians? When you're learning about like the strange and feathered people who live on just on the other side of the border, like that's not useful information, right? Those are curiosities. So practical texts were cures, right? They collected strange methods and remedies and strange stories that proved their efficacy. Sources, treatments, or methods often feature adjectives such as strange or unusual or extraordinary or miraculous. We encounter wondrous cures, and presumably readers attempted these cures that they found in these texts. They weren't just Barker's ruses. After all, what is curiosity if not inquiry after being confronted with a logical or practical conundrum, right? Something that runs counter to common knowledge. So when anomalies question the dominant paradigm, information categories blur. Let's see, where are we? Oh, we're here. Okay, so, so interlude. Around the time of the stuff I'm talking about, in China, the sort of like late 16th, early 17th century at the moment, a similar thing's going on, in the West. And Shakespeare's first folio, the first like collection of his plays, was published. And in the preface, written by the publishers Hemmings and Condell, it's entitled "To the Great Variety of Readers." And you may know this already, but let's just take a second to read a part of it, because I think it shows a sort of understanding on the part of publishers, in England and in China too, that they were writing not just for the elite. So this is "To the Great Variety of Readers." It says, "From the most able to him that can but spell, there you are numbered. We had rather you were weighed, especially when the fate of all books depends upon your capacities, and not of your heads alone, but of your purses. Well, it is now public, and you will stand for your privileges, we know, to read and censure. Do so, but buy it first. That doth best commend a book, the stationer's fees. Then, how odd soever your brains be, or your wisdoms, make your license the same, and spare not. Judge your 6 penny worth, your shillings worth, your 5 shillings worth at a time, or higher, so you rise to the just rates, and welcome. But whatever you do, buy. But it is not our province who only gather his works and give them to you to praise him. It is yours that read him, and there we hope to your diverse capacities you will find enough both to draw and hold you. For his wit can no more lie hid than it could be lost. Read him, therefore, and again, and if then you do not like him, surely you are in some manifest danger not to understand him. And so we leave you to other of his friends, whom if you need, can be your guides. If you need them not, you can lead yourselves and others. And such readers we wish him." All right. Okay. So similar thing is going on at the exact same moment in China. Right? You've got publishers' notes and advertisements to some popular collections of stories, right? And in prefaces to these collections, one of the authors, Feng Long, discusses writing even for those who cannot read. He says, "Since villagers, children, ordinary women, and peddlers are easily stirred to joy or wrath by what others do rightly or wrongly, take guidance in their actions from stories about the operations of karma, and they gain knowledge from hearsay and gossip, popular historical romances can well serve as supplements where the classics and histories are found lacking." But even for the most educated, Feng claims that novels and stories are repositories of knowledge. He says, quote, "What is real can be added to the archives of the imperial libraries, and what is unreal can inspire, edify, and profoundly move the audience. There is truth in what is real, but there is also truth in what is unreal." So publishers of entertainment literature and epistemic literature alike were aiming their wares at a broad readership. The publisher's note to this collection of stories begins, quote, "Even those who committed to the most rigorous scholarship have always included unofficial histories, in their studies. It is no wonder then that the lower classes find popular historical romances, most appealing." And then a century later, and again, stolen from Professor Smith here, in this, there's a daily use encyclopedia that has a advertising note appended to it. And it says, quote, "This book is designed to be appreciated by all four classes of people," which is to say, everybody. We cannot know how many people read these books or who they were, but it's clear that publishers expected their books to be used by a variety of readers for a variety of purposes. Okay, so, so one of the aims of my book is to try to understand these readers. Who were these readers? Who's the variety of readers, and how can we sort of get inside of their heads? Excuse me. In delightful but very rare occasions, we actually have, books that have readers' notes in the margins. But that's quite rare. We do have, there's a whole genre in pre-modern China called brush notes that are supposedly like the published notes, reading notes, but usually of fancy readers, of famous readers. But more often we have like collectiana, right, in which editors express their feelings as readers about what is important or in danger of being forgotten. In many other cases, we have reading notes hidden among other thoughts in these big collections, but we also find reading notes in commentary that was printed in between the lines of text or in the margins. We find them in prefaces. And some of my important sources are actually sequels, supplements, and appendices. A lot of important books, either primarily epistemic or entertainment, found themselves being appended, amended, or supplemented, or rewritten in the form of subsequent books that announce themselves as conscious responses to their parent text, right? So this is sort of, I think, similar impulses to like fan fiction today, right? Like you love something, or you're fascinated by something, but you are sort of not satisfied with something about it, or you find it incomplete, or some things are incorrect, and you set about writing another book to sort of supplement and append and correct it, right? And that is a kind of reading. So these, they wanted it to go on. They wanted to supplement it or to undo some aspect of it or fix it in some way. And we see this with epistemic texts too, in which readers wanted to contribute new knowledge to texts. And so we see this term, like, I'm translating this as like sequel, but you could translate it as supplement too. And so these are the two texts, these are the two dragon texts that we began with, the Ben Sao Gangmu, the medical one, and this is the Liao Jiaji, the supernatural one. But they both were published, hundreds of years after they were published, someone else put them out as, as sequels to these things. So you have these, so this is another way that we can sort of get into the minds of readers, is to try and see what's different about this text from the parent text. And then there are also appendices, right? There's like lots of, in these, especially in didactic or informational or epistemic texts, we encounter a lot of sort of entries that either the author or a subsequent author appends information to, right? And that usually is like, I don't know where this belongs. Like, I don't, like, this strange bird, right? I don't know, I've never seen it myself. Or Li Shuzhen talks about strong water that the foreigners have, that can like eat metal and has to be stored in glass. I've never seen such a thing, but I'm just writing it down here because I know it exists, or I've heard that it exists, and future generations can investigate that, find out what that's about. It was also a tool of the state to appeal to these sort of marginally literate readers and to normalize the strange. So just one of very many examples, but in 1594, a local official publishes this book, the illustrated exhortations and admonishments. And we still have, there are a number of extant copies, even though it's not printed on very high quality paper, which suggests that it was printed in very many copies. So this is a didactic text written specifically in simple language so that it can reach the greatest number of readers. And it contained 200 very short stories, each labeled either virtuous or wicked. With each title is like the retribution for, insert good or bad behavior. So like, the retribution for caring for your sick parents, and then it's a story about like somebody who cared for their sick parents and then like the heavens opened up and rained money. Or like the retribution for somebody who who denied their dead brother a sufficiently fabulous funeral and then he was like struck dead by thunder. And each of these stories is accompanied by a woodblock print that illustrates the plot, which is presumably to reach a still a broader readership, right? Maybe even those who can't read at all. Most frequently, the stories of goodness hinge on a filial act that's usually rewarded by a son passing the imperial examinations and attaining high office, though sometimes immortality. And predictably, the stories of evil deeds provoke much more imaginative responses from the cosmos. And often enough, villains meet their ends at the hands of earthly justice, but just as often they're targeted by thunder or ravenous tigers. It's unknowable if this official himself believed that, everything that's contained in his book, much of which aligns with accounts in these strange tales and anomalies in entertainment literature. But he definitely believed in reifying this gossip, right? Appealing to common sense would help him govern. And this is just like one example of these 200 stories. It's an account readers are told about this man who would quote unquote pluck life. These characters harvest life or pluck life from children using their the dates of their birth. If you knew the exact moment that someone was born and the exact day, you could do some magic and pluck their life, right? And then you could take that life, presumably, and turn them into demons. So here is the bad guy who has been caught. And these demons are former children whose life has been plucked and which he used to steal wealth once you pluck somebody's life, they're in your service, I guess. And so these demons went and stole wealth. But the story basically says there was a guy who used the dates of particularly intelligent children to pluck their life, and then the demons would create havoc and steal wealth. And he was caught, and he was sentenced to slow slicing, and his wife was exiled. The end. That's the whole story. So, to me, this is an interesting text because, it presumes, it is written for the most, the sort of least sophisticated reader possible, and yet it's expected that they're supposed to know what taishan, what plucking life is, right? It presumes all this stuff about common knowledge. I think we can learn a lot about, and it was understood that there were methods that that wizards could use to do these sorts of things. But that is not really strange, right? And the result is not strange, that there's an orderly cosmos, right? That the evil and the good alike get what's coming to them, either in this life or the next. But anyway, this is another way we can sort of get at the minds of readers, right? That they are supposed to understand a lot of the workings of this world and the cosmos itself. Okay. So another example where we can think about how to get into the minds of readers is to just look at intertextuality, right? There's this interesting text, Miscellanies from Yoyang. It has, I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit. It has all sorts of, it's a trivia miscellany, right? It has chapters on anomalous accounts, omens, unnatural calamities, local habits and customs, depictions of curious objects like magical swords, anecdotes of transformation, leaves turn into fish, and stones turn into birds. Remarkable feats, the beggar in the marketplace who doesn't have any arms paints beautiful calligraphy with his feet, and things like that, right? Oddities from border regions, delicious kinds of food, dreams, thunder, tattooing, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a miscellany, right? It's, in some ways, I think it's similar to like the Guinness Book of World Records. Like it's true, right? But it's curious. And one of the earliest bibliographies to mention this text classifies the Yoyonzatsu in the general category of what we now translate as novels, 小说, small talk, or gossip, or maybe. But that category in the pre-modern period is so vague, it's so huge, and it was just used as a repository for any fictional or non-fictional works that didn't fit into other more well-defined bibliographic categories. And this probably made the author of this book happy anyway, because Yoyang is a sort of a mystical mountain where a cache of strange texts were supposedly found. But 4 centuries later, it's moved out of the category of xiaoshuo or gossip or novels and classed with philosophies. And I won't go into too much, right? Anyway, these bibliographic categories, in my opinion, are confusing to modern scholars, right? We sort of assume that they're set in stone and that they are movable, or at least authoritative. And it's, in my research, it's very clear that many readers completely disregarded or were completely unaware of whatever bibliographic category or genre certain books were placed in. And as an example of that, we've got like 2 books that actually are in separate bibliographic categories, despite their similar names. Like this is a record of minor knowledge, and this is a record of daily knowledge, or knowledge that increases daily, maybe. But these 2 texts quote this one extensively, and as do many others, right? So that's another way that we can sort of get at how readers, and we have to think of authors as readers when there's all of this intertextuality and this constant referencing. But there's another way of looking at sort of authors as readers is to look at not just what they quoted, but how they quoted it. This is a passage from this book, the Schonebaum, that I keep talking about, the Materia Medica. And this is the original passage, well, the earliest extant passage we have of it. And it's clearly edited, right? So it's been edited for length, but I'll show you in a second how else it's been edited. But anyway, this we don't know, this may also have been edited from a previous longer text. But so this is like the English version. Everything in gray is the original passage, and everything in white is the passage that is in this like authoritative, medical text. And essentially it's just about a guy who develops a disease and that makes him incredibly hungry, and he eats so much food that it impoverishes his family, and they have to kick him out. And he goes around like begging at people's doors, and one day he knocks on the front door of a house, and there's dialogue, he's quoted, and they give him some food, and then he goes around to the back door and he knocks again and asks for more food, and the guy's like, just we're here. He's like, I didn't know your house had 2 doors. Anyway, so he gets kicked out, and then he finds the garden, and in the garden are shallots and garlic, right? Garlic, I think. And he eats them all, and then he vomits. And he vomits up what looks like a basket, although I really think it's a small dragon, but that's another issue. I think you take the bamboo radical off the top, and you've got a little dragon, which makes more sense. I've been reading this stuff a long time. It makes sense in my head. But anyway, the medical author is like, and this demonstrates how shallots and garlic are, useful to cure this illness, right? This then is proof of the ability of shallots to disperse nodes of garlic to dissolve concretion illness. So to me, this is sort of what, this is an example of what Jack Chen he just says that anecdotes and other miscellaneous bits of information were considered coeval in pre-modern China. That is to say, anecdotes are just miscellaneous bits of information encoded in a story, right? But we can see, like, we sort of, again, have to ask, though, like, what is strange? What is strange in this world? Oh, by the way, I wanted to point out that in this text, what Li Shizhen is doing, Li Shizhen is the medical author, he's essentially taking a story which bibliographers would call 传奇, and turning it into an anomalous account, a 直观, right? You cut out everything that looks like a story. You cut out all the dialogue and the tension and the denouement and and all of the exciting bits, and you're just left with information, right? He's like literally showing how stories encode information. And there's a million of these. I could go on and on. Okay, so but Li Shizhen talks, and like very many books that I admire and scholars I admire quote this, so I won't belabor it. But at the very end of his very large text that discusses all of the usefulness, all of the useful qualities of all of the plants and objects and animals in the world, he has a chapter on humans. He's talking about like how humans come in all different sort of shapes and sizes, and sometimes they come in sort of miraculous or strange forms. And at the very end, he says, this also states that all changes arise from the same chi. How can scholars with superficial knowledge rely on a narrow perspective to broadly dismiss the endless changes and transformations of things in the universe, both ancient and modern, as far-fetched and strange? So there were limits to what transformation could do. This pre-modern world in China was predicated on the idea that things turned into other things, right? There's no creation, there's no monotheistic God who created the world, and there won't be a destruction of the world. It's just a sort of endless cycle of transformation, but there had to be limits to what transformation could do, and to what it could explain, right? Some of those limits are bounded by common sense or common knowledge, and it's those limits, those patterns in the principle of nature that gives the world meaning. Things might share a certain kind of chi, but things could also be connected through shared characteristics and feelings or a common sense. When flowers or cloth transformed into butterflies, it was natural that they would be the same color as the thing that they transformed out of. It was when behavior or transformations diverged from expectations of these transformational relationships that it was deemed to be strange. Right? Transformation followed certain principles, without which it would be impossible to discern differences between things. These principles were at the heart of many debates about how the world worked and what the ultimate object of inquiry into natural phenomena. How can scholars not investigate things and their underlying principles to discern their benefits and harms, says Li. When something reached an extreme, the next step in a cycle of transformation was to begin again as its opposite. Right? For all the wonderment in the world, its underlying principles usually made sense. Yet Li also praised flexible thinking, often recounting details of previous physicians' creative approaches to difficult therapeutic situations and their abandonment of conventional logic in search of other underlying causes. He says, for occurrences outside of known principles, one should not make subjective judgments. Okay, so I have two different endings to this topic. We can end here if you have questions, or I could hit you with some more stuff. But if we go back to the dragons, the hibernating dragons, the parasitic dragons that we were talking about earlier, what is strange about those stories, right? And all of this stuff in yellow, I don't think is strange at all. Where'd it go? Okay, I don't think it's strange. It is not strange that dragons exist. Like, dragons exist, right? See, on my computer, this is orange. This is more clearly bridge. So up here, these are things that are not strange. It's not strange that dragons exist. Everybody knows dragons exist. It's not strange that dragons can transform, even into something as small as a thread or a caterpillar. We have millions of stories about that sort of thing in fiction and non-fictional epistemic and entertainment literature. It's not strange that dragons respond to the call of thunder. They may even create thunder sometimes. Like they're intimately entwined with rainmaking and the control of water and what we come to know as like meteorological phenomena. So none of that stuff is strange, right? This middle orange stuff is possibly strange. Like, is it weird that they would want to hibernate in a fingernail or an eyeball? Maybe. Is it strange that dragons act like bugs in this regard? I mean, I contend that like 50% of all humans had parasitic infections in the pre-modern world. So like, you know, if so many things invade human bodies, why not dragons? Maybe it's weird, maybe it's not. Is it strange that dragons cannot escape the body without the help of thunder or the call of thunder? They are supposed to be super powerful and numinous creatures, right? Maybe that's weird. But definitely, what is really weird, and the punchline to both of those stories, in my opinion, is that dragons can live in the human body and burst out of it without killing the host. To me, that's the really strange thing about these stories. I think that is what readers would say was a strange thing about those stories. So it's hard to imagine what it's like to be a reader in the pre-modern period. But, so that is the first ending. That's the end of this talk, right there. But let me just quickly, give me 5 more minutes, and I want to show you this one other thing that I think is cool. So I'll just give you the really quick version. So there are some medical texts. There are some medical manuscripts in the Berlin State Library that I've been working with for quite a while. And they are all made in sort of the late 19th and early 20th century. They're clearly made by individual healers for their own healing practice. And they are mostly reading notes. They're mostly just stuff copied out of medical texts. You know, clearly like you didn't have the opportunity to copy the whole medical text or purchase it. So you made notes for yourself. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff in there. And one of these medical texts quotes at length a novel. And that novel is called Quelling the Bandits, 当口吃. And it was, so we can, first of all, we can date this medical manuscript after the first publication, obviously, of that novel. And probably after 1871, which is when it was published in Shanghai, or even after it was republished in 1883. It had been published earlier in the century. The Taiping Rebellion happened, or the Civil War, as we now call it, and the Taiping general Li Xiuchang took Suzhou in 1860 and ordered that all copies of this novel be burned. So I would guess that it was like in 1871 or 1880 that this medical manuscript was created. Not this one, this is the novel. But the author of the medical manuscript observed taboos against writing the name of the emperor. So he was probably writing before 1911, which was, the fall of empire. And although some people still observed imperial taboos, after that point. But anyway, the point is, this novel, this one on the right, Quell the Bandits, is it's a complex and fascinating novel that modern bibliographers frequently refer to as science fiction. And it's complicated and it's sort of shocking in its way for undoing the point and ethos of the work that it purports to be a sequel of, which is The Outlaw of the Marsh, one of the most famous pre-modern Chinese novels. So this one purports to be a supplement to this novel, but in many ways it sort of undoes the sort of Robin Hood-like ethos of the parent novel. And I'll sort of skip that. But okay, this one's about like band of Robin Hood type people who rob from the rich, give the poor. And then this one is very much like pro Manchu Qing government. Anyway, so this one sought to repudiate the bandit ideology of outlaws. Its heroes and heroines rise to serve the Song court and succeed in eliminating other rebels and their ethos. So it's very sort of conservative, right? And but it also addresses a range of issues that become central concerns for politically engaged writers in the 20th century. So there's this medical manuscript that quotes this at length, that was written exactly in this moment, right? And yet, it is not at all interested in any of that stuff. This manuscript here, it's interested in foreign bug medications, and copies at length a passage about, I'll just skip forward, about trying to catch the ginseng spirit. And in the novel has a passage about like the bandits that are all like going to the mountain, they're gonna go capture this spirit in the mountain that comes out at night, and it's super agile, and it runs around, and it's super strong, and it's a ginseng spirit, and if you can catch it, it can cure like any illness, but it's very hard to catch, and they indeed fail to catch it in the novel. But so the medical manuscript writes this passage down about how you might go about finding and catching the ginseng spirit, but this is both in the novel and is common, is found in a lot of medical texts. This idea that like when a ginseng root has a human physical appearance, it is endowed with spirit, right? It becomes like a more potent medicine, and indeed, like in many cases, ginseng roots that look like people were more expensive. But anyway, so this is all just to say that our physician reader, right? It's not clear if his reading of this novel was like blithely unaware of the sort of Quill the Bandit's social and literary critique, or if he simply did not record those thoughts in his manuscript. But it does show at least two things. The first is that he did not read this xiaoshuo as fiction, right? He didn't read this novel as if it were fiction. After all, it was, as many novels were, both banned by the Taiping Kingdom and promoted by the Qing, right? And because of an overwhelming belief that people would imitate it, right? That people would imitate what they found there. And the effective power of entertainment literature defied its own fictionality. The novel could be constructed, but its effects were real. And second, this reading suggests a belief in the supernatural that coexisted with the notion of realism that prefigured the Boxers, right? The Boxer Rebellion, where it was sort of an anti-foreign movement, and the Boxers, so named by the British, were martial artists who believed, many of whom believed that they were bulletproof. And the demonstration that they weren't bulletproof, in fact, is what a lot of scholars sort of consider the end of magic in China. But this medical healer's reading of this novel also demonstrates that what we modern scholars often think of as strange was not only not strange, but preferable to certain kinds of modern technology and science. The end, the other end. Thanks.
Now, as I understand it, we can entertain questions from the audience, and some are going to also be asked by the people that are zooming in. So shall we start with this audience here?
Yeah.
With the live?
Can we see the Zoom audience or their questions?
And I'm sorry, you know my problem here, I can't hear a thing.
Yes.
I'm sorry, folks, I have a terrible ear infections, and I can't hear very much at all. And I didn't want to have to say it, but I have to explain it.
I was just worried about the Zoom audience, and if they can.
All right.
Casey has a question that
So-
we can start with Rich. Casey, we can start with Casey's question.
I'm sorry.
Hey,
Let's
I'll
do it,
ask
Casey.
a question.
Oh, okay,
While
great.
you're looking at the Zoom, just quick comment and question. The plucking life thing, being from New Orleans, just sounded exactly like something you get in voodoo.
Yeah.
You know? And then my question, I don't know if you have ever worked with the supplement to Journey to the West, but you know, I taught that last semester, and I was like, this is the weirdest thing ever.
Yeah.
And you know, it also includes a lot of, you know, I want to pick Rich and your brain about it because it's got all this stuff about, you know, classic of changes and you know, divination, vavois. I don't know if you have any thoughts about it, because that was, you know, your presentation has made me, you know, when I read that, my tendency is to just think of it as completely fantastical, out there, dreamland, Alice in Wonderland kind of stuff. But then I wonder, well, like how, I mean, you know, Xiaoji had to be seen as fantastical, right? To Ming Dynasty people, but maybe not quite as fantastical as it seems to us. And then like all of the strange things that happen in the novel with like the sort of revenge fantasy against that Song Dynasty minister who sold out the Song Dynasty to the Jin.
Yeah.
And there's this like long, really gory, sadistic passage where he gets chopped to bits in hell. And it's like, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know if you have any comments on that novel to help me give my students a better perspective on it, because I was like, this is hard to explain.
Well, I think it's similar to a lot of the novels I'm talking about in my book here. Let me just bring up the title again so you can remember that. Like, so I'm talking about fantasy, curiosity, and common knowledge, right? And so my idea here is not, like some people get really upset when I talk about this sort of blithe disregard for genre on the part of a number of readers, right? Like, a lot of people like genres. A lot of people like, you know, and obviously there are a lot of rules governing poetry, certain kinds of poetry, and exactly, you know, this is how we judge what is really good poetry from what is so-so poetry, right? It's these generic rules, we have to have them. And we do. I'm not saying we don't. I'm not saying we need to disregard genre. I'm saying that a lot of pre-modern readers either disregarded genre or had a much more sort of open-minded approach to the kinds of things you can find in a fantastical novel, right? I mean, just because like Monkey goes to heaven and beats up everybody doesn't mean that when he gives the king of the Scarlet Purple Kingdom some medicine, that's not good medicine, like real medicine. You know, so like, I just think that readers were sort of had a more, you know, possibly naive, but also just possibly more open-minded attitude about like where you can find information. And also I think it's important to realize that like they couldn't just go to the library and check out books, right? I mean, they had to borrow them from their friends or whatever the guy with the library cart came by, it was whatever he had. And if you wanted to know things, especially if you were like nouveau riche and your parents hadn't taught you about how to operate in a brothel or how to whatever sow crops or tell, you know, predict the future from the stars, you got it wherever you could get it, you know. And so for me, yeah, Xiaobu is wonderful and weird and in many ways shows a very sophisticated understanding, or like Jinghua Yuan, you know, like flowers in the mirror, like a very sophisticated understanding of in fact Western science and technology, right? Like how can you calculate how far away lightning is based on the sound of thunder? It's in there, right? But we also have people use it, like records of people using the medicines they found in those novels on their relatives, you know? So it's both, right? And I think it's just important to understand it's both or it's everything, right? So I think it's just sort of important to understand that you can have a novel that is obviously fantastic or strange or anomalous, and it can also be, you know, instructive at the same time.
Can I interject here? I'm sorry, I can't hear much. I was able to appreciate your text. And so I'm not sure that what I'm going to say is going to be germane here. But your great contribution seems to me to be in all of your written work and in this forthcoming book as well, that it doesn't discriminate in the ways that Westerners discriminate. We don't have these kind of categories of true and false, much less the ones that, we sort of think about like philosophy and religion and this and that. But when we start to think about this in our own experience, I know I'm going to regret saying this, but I'm going to. In a recent election, there was information there that people took as knowledge, whether it was true or not. And it seems to me that we have to, in our own personal experience and also in our intellectual experience, understand what you're doing, and that is you're introducing this tremendous range of knowledge and saying, let's not try to call this superstition, which I always have believed is what people call what they don't believe. But, that these categories swirl around in our consciousness and are part of a knowledge base that I think academics fail to appreciate.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. I mean, I think it's not just Westerners. I think it's like May 4th writers, and we sort of like take them as a sort of this hegemony about how Chinese literature works. And, in modern bibliographic categories, we sort of like just take them as fact. I mean, they're like librarians are good and hardworking people, and they have to classify things and catalog things, and they're the experts. So we just sort of go along with that. But I think just the example of xiaoshu and how we sort of arbitrarily translate that as fiction when it clearly meant minor knowledge, like things that aren't really important. That's what it was. It was like a place to put stuff that was weird and interesting and entertaining and probably true.
Any other, yes?
So I want to ask a question, and I'm an anthropologist, and I may have a very different canon. So, I'm asking a question. I don't know if you know the book Karen Barber, The Anthropology of Text, Persons, and Poets.
I don't.
Okay, so it might be a very useful book.
Okay.
And the reason that I'm bringing it up is one of the things that she talks about is that one of the things that anthropologists think a lot about is the ways in which you contextualize bits of text and remove them from their surrounding text and interweave them in new text. Turns out when you begin to watch this pattern, you kind of see this as pattern, you begin to understand quite a bit about how expertise is being constructed and what people understand about social organization. And the last example you gave was precisely about the work of contextualization in creating systems of authority. And so I wanted to ask you if there were patterns in contextualization that you can see in these texts that end up illuminating ideas about either common knowledge or expertise.
Well, it's a great question, and I'm definitely going to look up that source. But I think, well, first of all, we have to ask sort of like what kind of expertise are we talking about?
Yeah.
Like this medical text I keep alluding to, definitely the author, Li Shichen, or the editor, or whatever you want to call him, the compiler, he's definitely trying to recreate this old genre and make it new and make himself this authority figure. But he had to go around sort of begging people to write prefaces to it, and it wasn't a foregone conclusion that he would succeed in becoming this authority, which he did, right? And then subsequent books all take the title of his book for the title of their book, supplement to or addition to or sequel to his book. So that's one kind of authority, right? Like I'm an authority of, like I'm gonna create natural history or natural science as a thing. As I created it, I'm an authority of it. But then there's, as you point out or allude to, like this Dang Houji novel, Dang Houji, it's very much a social critique, right? It's like it's a critique that is sort of pro-government. And is very, and so in that regard is or even that illustrated admonishments, right? It's like, I'm the authority, I know what is virtuous and what will be punished. But to me, it's interesting that readers can completely ignore one kind of authority, right? No matter how explicit or convincing an author might be in constructing their own authority, there are still readers that they're completely uninterested or unaware that that's what's happening. So, but yeah, I agree. It is interesting to think about the construction of authority. But since these texts were so often collected, like the texts that I read or that I read are collected texts that get their texts from collected texts.
Yes.
And it's unclear why, like, what was the guiding principle for this collection, right? I think it was just like books this guy had in his library or books that he could get his hands on or something. It's not like very clear thematically or generically like why this one. Some compendia are like medical stories. And you're like, okay, well that makes sense. But then other compendia are just like good books, And so it's not like authority is not at all clear in at that time. So it's sort of I would be interested to think about like how authority is constructed without the context or like prior authority.
It sounds almost like a Chinese version of what they call commonplace books.
Yeah, it is. It's very similar, I think. But I think you could argue similar stuff though. That if you read the prefaces to these, not just Shakespeare, but like it's clear that there's multiple readerships, right? And it's also clear that in sort of nascent globalization, there were rich people who couldn't read or couldn't read very well. Like you could buy Shakespeare's first folio, you could afford to buy this very expensive book and not be able to read it, right? And so it's like this commodity art item, trophy, and it's like on one hand you could buy this extremely expensive book and still need to read these like rudimentary sort of commonplace books or daily use encyclopedias.
Yeah, we have a question from one of the Zoom participants, which I think intersects with what you've been talking about. She says, she, Huang Kangni, thank you for the wonderful talk. I have a question about what we might call genres. We all know that the term 小说 in early modern China does not equal fiction in a modern sense, but what about different types of 小说? Do you see in your research certain distinctions from the reader's perspective between different types of 小说, for example, between full-length novels and stories written in classical Chinese? Are they treated equally in the kind of archivist reading you seem to suggest?
Oh yeah, that's a really good question. No, they're not treated the same. Classical, stories written in classical don't encode the same kinds, like classical is such a terse language, and it's, it can encode so much with so few words that in my experience, I have not found the same kinds of like information encoded in classical stories, except for, of course, like the very late ones, like Liao Zhai Zhi or Yue Wei Cao Tang Biji, these huge collections of like of supernatural stories or anomalous accounts. To me, those are very clearly trying to investigate the world. They can make records to be studied later. But like if you look at like Tang Xiaoshuo, in my opinion, I'm not seeing as much. But and Li Shizhen and other medical authors, they don't quote those nearly as often as they quote as they quote other like the miscellanies and things like that.
Well, here's a follow-up question, as if she had heard you, or he, she, again, I don't know. Shirke Dian, thanks for your great lecture today. It is very interesting and inspiring. I have a question about the relationship between vernacular novel and non-fictional medical writing. You mentioned medical practitioners may not read novels as strange, but something practical and useful. Could it be possible that the novel composers borrowed the knowledge directly from the earlier medical writings? For example, some Ming novels may directly copy text from other intellectual works and integrate them into their narrative. I saw cases in which methods of predicting weather and how to navigate the sea were copied or adapted into a Ming novel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. Yeah, I mean, one of the ways to demonstrate, virtuosity in writing a vernacular novel, a long vernacular novel, is this ridiculous degree of intertextuality, right? To cite and quote every manner of text. I mean, Holomong and Jinping in particular are so dense in this regard. And but what's interesting, right, is not just that they quote medical texts or that they quote Wanbao Chuanshu encyclopedias and stuff, which they do, but they frequently misquote them, right? They will, and you have to ask, like, is that intentional? Like, did they just misremember it? Or like, I talk about an example in Jinping, right, where they're doing divination, and the diviner is making calculations and explaining the calculations, and the calculations are incorrect. I mean, they're correct in the context of the novel, like all the characters are agreeing and nodding their heads and stuff. But if you get out the almanac, you can see those days do not correlate to those days in that year. And so you have to ask, like, well, why is it different? And is it to protect, is it that a living person might actually have those birthdays and the author didn't want to suggest that the reader might actually have a woman, a meager fate, right? But yeah, I mean, these long vernacular novels, they quote everything, and then they in turn were quoted, and it wasn't at all clear if subsequent readers knew that what they were quoting was the novel or its quoted text, right? So it's complicated, but the point is that there were a wide variety of readers that used all of these complicated texts for different reasons.
And that is the beauty of it. I was thinking of, and I'm sure Professor Xu has also encountered this in her medical research, that we think sometimes, well, you get a medical evaluation from your doctor. I've seen 3 in the past week. But, the doctor has that authority, and then maybe you seek a second opinion. But I think in the Chinese context, there was a much greater openness to all kinds of things, Buddhist and Taoist, charms, and these medicines from novels, and all kinds of other places. And we, again, our intellectual habit, I think, is to compartmentalize in ways that lived life in late imperial China, early modern China didn't. I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Very much like you said, different physicians can have different opinions, and it's really, you can have conflicting medical knowledge from different sources, so I think that's...
I remember coming across some person who sought 13 different medical solutions or religious solutions for one physical problem. So, I think that's, again, we just have this habit in Western intellectual life of trying to see the either and the or rather than the and the both.
Yes.
Any other questions here? I think probably we're taxing the energy of our speaker, but, well, let me just say thank you very much. This has been most enlightening, most interesting. Right up there with Fairbank and Spence and Needham.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.